Thank you for joining us today. I'm Candice Mathis.
And I'm Debbie Nichols, and this is In the Tall Grass with the two Alpha Gals.
We invite you on this journey to experience some of the things we're doing to survive, reinvent the world around us, build resilience, and ultimately find joy.
So take a deep breath. We're in this together. As you may have seen, the Today Show featured a piece on alpha-gal syndrome. Our very own Candice Mathis was even interviewed by Morgan Chesky on the show. And so while we are no doubt grateful to the Today Show for raising awareness of AGS, there's still so much more to alpha-gal syndrome than what could be included in those, the time of the brief segments. So one of the most important things that wasn't addressed in the Today Show piece is how you might know if you've contracted alpha-gal from a tick bite. Because the thing about alpha-gal is it can look completely different from person to person. And Candice and I are perfect examples of that. So today we want to talk about symptoms and things you might experience that could indicate it might be time for an alpha-gal test. So Candice, why don't you go ahead and tell us about some of the symptoms you experienced from start to finish, because it was over a long period of time. And I feel like you had such a wide variety in there.
Okay. Yeah, absolutely. So in 2007, I was bitten by a tick while my husband and I were visiting a bed and breakfast in Floyd, Virginia. We had walked through the grass and I had a tiny, tiny seed tick on my pinky toe. And being almost like 9 months pregnant, I couldn't see like that it was actually a tick on my toe until 3 days later. I thought it was a speck of dirt. So finally, my husband realized that it was indeed a tick. And once I was bitten, no rash developed. I didn't see a bullseye rash or anything to that degree. So I kind of just went on my way. Well, a month later, I started developing pretty severe GI symptoms. So I would eat dinner and I would get pretty bad stabbing pains in my stomach, probably about an hour after eating. And then I would really have massive GI distress the next morning. So my reactions were pretty delayed as far as when they became more severe. This was happening multiple times a week. So I ended up seeing my PCP, who then sent me for a gallbladder ultrasound. And then I was sent to a GI specialist, and no one could figure out why I was having these symptoms. So I would be literally on the toilet, almost passing out, having to like strip my clothes off with my husband's work, like on hold in case I did, because I had a newborn at the time and a 2 and a 4-year-old. So it was horrible. So fast forward like a year, I was kind of trying to figure out what was happening, going to all these specialists. And I was finally diagnosed with a wheat allergy after breaking out in hives all over my face, probably like 9 months after the initial onset of this. And so I eliminated wheat from my diet. Things started to improve. And little by little over the years, I started having these symptoms again, and they would come and go. And I'd have no idea why, because I was super strict being gluten-free. And I remember waking up in the middle of the night several times with my blood pressure tanking, feeling like I was going to pass out after I ate pork or steak. And so I was like, well, beef and pork just don't agree with me. So I kind of stayed away from them for a while. So fast forward through all of that, usually it was just those GI kind of symptoms. And then things started to get a little more intense after I sought out help from a functional medical doctor in 2018. I've had some thyroid stuff, so I was trying to get to the bottom of that and really the root cause of my food allergies. Never suspected that it was ever linked to the tick bite. So it was 5 days after I was put on a barrage of supplements that contained bovine and porcine ingredients and were all in gel caps. I mean, I was taking like 11 supplements a day. It was a lot. I woke up to the room spinning, my heart racing, seeing double. I thought I was having a stroke. I had no idea what was happening. And that was what kind of set me on the path to figuring out that I actually had alpha-gal syndrome. A lot of fatigue. I, couldn't do anything. So that was, as you know, such a hard time for me. But I find it so fascinating that we both were going on this journey and we didn't even know each other at the same time. So can you share a little bit? Because I know your symptoms are different than mine, but I do love that our stories both kind of started in 2007 before we even knew each other existed.
I know it's pretty wild to think about that, because I think my symptoms started around the same time, which for both of us was before alpha-gal syndrome was even a thing. I mean, it was obviously out there, but before it was actually named, I guess, and became a syndrome that could be diagnosed. Right. So, as I said, I started around the same time, 2007, 2008. I just kind of associated it with when my kids were really little. And I had the same as you. The GI symptoms were awful, and they would often happen in the middle of the night, and but not always, because there were times when I was out, and that's a risk you take when you have GI issues, that you don't make it home, and that's pretty miserable. But so I had the GI symptoms, and what I would do is I would, start with my PCP, who would tell me that nothing was wrong, and then I would ask to see a specialist. I'd go to a GI, and we would go through, all the tests, the endoscopy, the colonoscopy, the gallbladder scan, all those things, some of which you had mentioned too, and just finding absolutely nothing. And you kind of just want to go back to the drawing board. But, I would start in with another symptom, and another really big one for me was the joint pain. So, I was sure I had Lyme disease several times in my life, and the test would always come out negative, but I would have this joint pain. And here I was in like my late 20s, early 30s, and I couldn't lay on the bed on my side to read the kids a book, because I wouldn't be able to get up, because my shoulder, my hip, it was just so painful after lying there, putting pressure on them. So I would go back to the PCP, who would send me to, an orthopedic or physical therapy. And again, they would tell me that nothing was wrong. Another symptom I had was this crazy brain fog, which, as you and I refer to as tick brain, because it comes and goes still on occasion. And but there were periods where my brain was so foggy that I couldn't remember the number on my house. And I would sit at the end of the driveway, knowing I needed to pick up the mail, knowing which mailbox was mine, but refusing to get out of the car until I could recall the house number, because it was just so startling. I was thinking early onset dementia of some kind, that here I was getting in my 30s, and everybody was telling me I was fine, right? I was coming up fine for the autoimmune diseases, for Lyme, for everything. And then they would send me to a neurologist, and everything was fine there. And, I've said this before, but when you hear that you're fine from one doctor, when you don't feel fine, is one thing. But when you're getting this answer that there's nothing wrong with you, and you're seeing all these specialists, and they're all saying this, you start to think that you really do have a problem in your head. And so I would stop when they would tell me everything was fine, and until I couldn't handle it anymore. And then I would go back to starting the cycle over, PCP to specialist, to deal with the GI, the joint pain, the fatigue, the brain fog. And like you, I made a connection between, especially the GI, well, really it was only the GI issues and red meat. And so I would eat it sparingly, knowing that I was going to experience some discomfort. But I think it was after a steak at a wedding, 5, 6, 7, no longer, maybe 7 or 8 years ago. And I'd had steak for dinner, and I woke up that night and I thought I was dying. Like, I remember being in the shower, like just trying not to scream. I was like crouching on the floor. My husband was standing there, concerned. And I thought my stomach was going to split in half. It was just this excruciating pain. And so that's when I mostly cut out red meat. Like, occasionally I would eat a burger because they're good. But I knew that I was going to have some GI distress, whether it was, the pain or diarrhea or gas or some combination of that. And it just wasn't worth it most of the time. So those were my symptoms. I mean, when I think about symptoms of alpha-gal syndrome, we hear about the people who have exclusively the GI symptoms. So right. When we talk to Dr. McGill, who is a GI specialist down at UNC, she has actually, drawn this connection between patients who are diagnosed with IBS based on excluding other root causes of things, and how so many of them could potentially have alpha-gal syndrome. So if you're out there and you have undiagnosed IBS symptoms, you might want to consider getting tested.
Right. Yeah. And I think you brought up some really great points of, gosh, I mean, I feel like we could dive into a lot of different avenues of this, of like not giving up and being your own advocate when you know something is not right with yourself. But also, I think you and I are prime examples of going years feeling like trash.
Yeah.
And like, you know what I mean? Like still, I would still eat bacon. I would still eat burgers. I would still eat ice cream, even though I knew the next morning was probably going to be bad. And I was probably going to be praying, driving home from bringing my kids to school, that I made it, you know, like, but I think you get so conditioned to just feeling the way you feel that you don't think about it in depth, like, or at least I feel like that's how I lived for so many years, where it was just like, well, if I have a sensitive stomach,
right.
I don't know. And it wasn't until that really acute night that made me say, wait, something's really, really wrong. And it was a very, you know, that was such a traumatic event for me. I don't ever wish on anyone to wake up out of a dead sleep seeing double and the room spinning. Like, it is a very unnerving feeling. And you know, I mean, we were friends for less than a year, probably at that point. And you saw me healthy. I'm going to say healthy kind of in quotations, to like completely flatlined, right? Like, it was terrifying. I didn't know if I had cancer or brain tumor, like what was going on. And, you know, to your point earlier, where you were seeing, you know, specialist PCP, you know, having this vicious cycle, I got put into that cycle pretty severely. And it's very devastating and defeating to hear from practitioners that we don't know what's wrong with you. Don't go to the ER. We don't know what we would do with you, you know. And I know that if I hadn't insisted on being sent out to UVA, I mean, I feel grateful that we live where we are because it is more recognized than other parts of the country. But I had to be insistent. And I think it just goes to show that when you do understand the symptoms and how they can be a part of alpha-gal syndrome, how we have to empower ourselves to take the step to ask for what we need. And I think you are a beautiful example of that as well, because I mean, I know when we were talking, when I left UVA, and I was like, Debbie, I never could believe like I'm still eating all this stuff. And, you know, I think we both had to get really comfortable being vulnerable with each other in, you know, a new relationship, but I felt like we did a really good job of that. And I just remember how you would ask me like, so did you have this symptom? Without like really, you know, diving into the question of like, should I go get tested? It was like, you were kind of sidestepping it a little bit. So like, what was the tipping point for you to actually go ask for the test after I was diagnosed?
Well, honestly, I think it probably was you being diagnosed with it and having ruled out so many things, having had my gallbladder taken out. This was a pretty definitive test. And so I had done my reading on it. I think even prior to your diagnosis, we had talked about it a little bit, but really it seemed like such a stretch to be allergic to mammal, right? Or red meat, as it's so often, you know, described in online and everywhere else. But when we now know that it's much broader than that. But yeah, I think it was when you got your test, I was like, you know what, this is one way for me to rule something else out, if nothing else. And so I did. It was probably one of the times I'm the most proud of being my own advocate, was going back to my allergy and immunologist, who had, you know, I'd seen multiple times, had diagnosed me with new allergies, but not alpha-gal. And I insisted on being tested for it, and it came back positive. And, you know, it's funny. I think a lot about getting a diagnosis and becoming a patient, right? Like we had this new, I'll call it an identity, even though it doesn't make us who we are, right. This new piece of our identity, which, you know, we're living with alpha-gal syndrome, but which is disappointing in some ways, in the way that, yeah, there's a lot of things I really miss. You know, I can live without steak. I can even live without bacon, which I never thought would be the case. But like, my mom brought my husband this past week a pie, a coconut cream pie. And that was like one of my favorite things. And I couldn't have it. And so it is discouraging at times, but having that diagnosis. But I remember so clearly, I was diagnosed in August, and it was middle to the end of November when I was driving home, probably from dropping my kids off somewhere. And I realized that my thoughts were clearer. Like it was the most obvious change because I've been, getting ready to start the round of seeing doctors again. And it had been, a couple of months and the brain fog wasn't gone. And I was driving home and I realized that my head was clearer. And that alone was enough reason, the GI symptoms are bad and fatigue is bad, joint pain's bad. Every piece of it is not great, right?
Yeah.
But thinking that you might be losing your mind, you might be heading into dementia, you might not remember your kids, and having that come back to you all of a sudden, it was worth it. I wouldn't even take coconut cream pie in exchange for that. So if anything's to be learned from that, there is an upside to knowing that you have alpha-gal syndrome and addressing these symptoms.
Yeah. And I think that it's when you really do start to feel better,
yes,
it's like you don't know what you don't know until you're like starting to step into the light again, and that was the same for me. I stress this a lot on our social media is anaphylaxis looks different for every person. And I had no clue that the event that I experienced that night was indeed anaphylaxis until Dr. Commons said that to me,
Yeah, I think that's worth addressing too. Because I don't think either of us had a clear picture of what that looks like, right? Because on TV or in the movies, it's depicted as one group of symptoms and that's it. The throat closing, throat swelling, not being able to breathe. And it can be very different from that.
Yeah.
Why don't you go through your symptoms on when you experience anaphylaxis?
So for me, it starts a little less severe. When I was acute, it was waking me up in the middle of the night with my heart racing out of a dead sleep. My blood pressure would drop. I would be nauseous or I would have GI issues. And, thankfully, I didn't even know at the time that that's what it was. And thankfully, I didn't go into anaphylactic shock during all of that. But now that I know, and I have, my toolkit and my EpiPens and all of the things that I need to kind of mitigate the reaction, I would start with either, my face sometimes gets flushed, sometimes it doesn't, but my blood pressure is always my indicator. So if I have any other symptom going on, oddly enough, I've learned that our histamine, we have more histamines in our stomach and I guess more so of mast cells. And that's what releases the histamines. And a lot of my anaphylactic episodes actually happened when I had a severe upset stomach. So I'm like in the bathroom when this is going south. And so it would be diarrhea, lightheadedness, heart racing. And then ultimately I would take my blood pressure and it was dropping like dramatically. So thankfully I've never actually passed out, but I've been very close to it. So those are some of my big ones. And then I will also start to get hoarse or my chest starts to get tight. So the respiratory side of this is one of the last things that affects me. It's not the beginning. I don't always break out in hives. I've never had my throat close. My tongue has swollen a few times. So it's kind of been all over the place, but hives and swelling has not been the number one reaction that I've experienced.
And something interesting about that too is that your anaphylaxis, even from episode to episode, doesn't look the same, right? And so one thing I learned from the immunologist that I saw after I was diagnosed with alpha-gal syndrome was that, and you should check with your own doctor about how they feel about this, what they say about this. But what she told me at the time was, if I have any two of these systems in play, if I have, if I'm having a skin reaction plus a stomach reaction, or, my chest will get tight, my heart races. Another big symptom for me is this feeling of impending doom, which is how it's described, I think, in a lot of the Lyme community. this feeling that something really bad is going to happen, and you know that things aren't right and things are off. And I thought it was just sort of that was tied in with anxiety, but it's not. It very clearly happens to me when I'm having one of these severe allergic reactions. But my doctor said if two systems are in play, that's the time to use your EpiPen.
Yeah. And I had the same thing happen to me in Colorado when I was at the ER twice. Both ER doctors told me, or actually they asked me, why didn't you use your EpiPen? And I was like, I didn't know, so it took a long time for me to understand when was appropriate and when was not. And that was exactly what they told me also. So, I do think that there's some credibility to that. And
yeah,
because you just don't know, I don't think how fast it could go to where you have restricted breathing. And that's what you're trying to avoid.
That's right. I think most people have probably heard my story about the cruise ship because it's my story of anaphylaxis.
That again.
Yeah, well,
so good.
I think the problem is that I was in a situation where I didn't have access to a hospital. Like I knew I had to deal with this. I had to deal with the reaction early on because I didn't have another choice, right? If things got really bad, it was going to get even worse, right? Because of the limited medical care that was on board. But I woke up that night with the feeling of impending doom. My family was on a winter cruise together. And then my stomach went. I knew that I had two systems in play at that point. So I got up and I took Benadryl, which I know better now is just the liquid Benadryl, which, can include mammal ingredients. So I may have actually aggravated my symptoms, but then I went on the top deck to try to get some fresh air and find like some cold water to drink. And my heart was like racing. Like it's not just beating hard. It is feeling like it is going to leap out of your chest into your throat and kill you. Like
it's terrible.
It's terrible. It's a terrible feeling. And finally, a really nice guy, a nice worker there on the cruise ship. I mean, it must have been 12 a.m., 1 a.m. He insisted that he was taking me down to the medical office, and we could go into an entirely different conversation about what happened down there and whether or not they believed me if I was going into anaphylactic based on red meat that I had not consumed or was not aware that I had consumed. And everybody was being careful. There's a lot of topics of conversation here, but my anaphylaxis didn't look like all the typical anaphylaxis I had expected. And they ended up giving me an EpiPen because I was indeed having an anaphylactic reaction. With the proper medical care, they were able to get it under control. And I didn't have to, we didn't have as an emergency situation as might have happened.
Right.
But yeah, I mean, it's so interesting to me that all these symptoms look so different from person to person. They mimic so many other conditions or illnesses. And then the anaphylactic reaction can look different from person to person. Something else to be said here, I think, is that I've heard alpha-gal syndrome be referred to as an anytime syndrome versus an every time syndrome. So that's worth mentioning too, because there have been times where I've been accidentally exposed and I have not reacted. I've expected a reaction and I haven't. And then there have been times where I'm sure I didn't get contaminated and yet I go into a terrible reaction. So it can be that sometimes you have symptoms and reactions and sometimes you don't. And you can be fine for a year and not react to casing on chicken sausages and then have an anaphylactic reaction just out of the blue to it. So that's a good thing to keep in mind when you're assessing your own symptoms.
Yeah, absolutely. Because it can. I mean, I think it can turn on a dime, and it's what makes this syndrome so complex for people. And, I would definitely say if you have been experiencing any of the symptoms that we've talked about on here and, you don't have any sort of diagnosis or you've been given the runaround saying, oh, it's in your head, or no, nothing's wrong with you, your PCP can run this test and will actually put the proper test codes that the alphagalinformation.org has on their website for LabCorp and Quest. It's one blood test. It's not a panel. And we'll put that in the show notes so that you have access to it if it's something that you feel you need to talk with your doctor about.
Yeah, that's a great idea.
I think we've shared so many great nuggets with people of information. I mean, I think you and I could clearly talk about our symptoms and go into even more depth like all day long because we've been dealing with this for 4 years. But I think that this is a great starting place for people. Do you have anything else you'd like to share before we wrap it up?
Well, there's so much more that I'd like to share. I feel like we could have segued into a lot of different topics of conversation, but just, to reiterate and echo what Candice said, we do have the right to be our own advocate, especially when it comes to medical care. And just because people tell you that they don't think that there's anything wrong with you, we're living proof that we were told that for over 10 years each. And there was definitely something wrong with us. So don't be afraid to go in and ask for it. Don't be afraid to think you know what you have and go in and tell your doctor and request a test. So one of the main foundations behind what Candice and I are hoping to do with Two Alpha Gals is living with joy, which can be really hard to do sometimes when you're living with alpha-gal syndrome or other food allergies or other chronic diseases. But one of the ways that Candice and I often find joy is through music. We both are very, very big music lovers, and it's something that we can't get alpha-gal from. We can't get a reaction from. So we decided when we were talking about starting this podcast that we wanted to ask all of our guests on the show if there was a particular song that brings them joy, whether it's always or at the moment. And so I would dare to ask Candice, is there a song that brings you joy? Either one that you've always felt that way about it, or just right now, or just in this moment?
This is a really hard question for me.
It's hard to narrow it down, isn't it?
It is it's really hard to narrow it down. I will say, I think I might start from when I was really acute. I love all kinds of music, but one of my loves kind of flourished during my really, really acute phase. And that was for Dave Brubeck, and his Take 5 album was I listened to that on repeat. So that was kind of the first one that came to my mind, but I think it would be fun for us to share each time. Okay. Yes. So what is yours, either all time or in this moment?
Okay. So I think that I'm going to go with all time, with hopes that we get another chance to share this and actually maybe even put together a Spotify playlist. So I think the song that brings me joy almost all the time, that I know can bring me out of a rut. Well, the whole genre of reggae, I think, makes me feel that way. I just feel really joyful when I listen to it. And it's hard not to be most of the time, for me anyway. And so I think I would have to go with Three Little Birds by Bob Marley.
Love that song.
So yeah, good. It just makes me feel like every little thing really is going to be all right.
Right.
So that's what I would go with today. So keep an eye out for our Spotify playlist of Two Alpha Gals Joyful Songs.
Nice. We do want to thank the Today Show for addressing alpha-gal syndrome, and we look forward to continuing the conversation. Yep. Until next time, thank you for joining us today on In the Tall Grass. Visit us at twoalphagals.com. That's TWO alphagals.com. Or you can find us on Instagram and Facebook at Two Alpha Gals. If you enjoyed listening, please leave a review and help us grow our community.
We're all faced with obstacles on our journey, whether it be food allergies or tick-borne diseases. You might outgrow the reactions, but you won't outgrow the person you become. Ticks suck, but life doesn't have to.